In this PowerPoint, we will be reviewing some of the more commonly used co-teaching models. When we start talking about co-teaching models, this could be a whole course in and of itself. There's no way we can get into all the possibilities and all the details about all those possibilities in just one course or one module. However, I do want you to be familiar with the co-teaching models so that you can recognize when they're being used appropriately in a classroom that you're a part of. I encourage you to learn as much as you can about these co-teaching models. I trust that you will be learning more about them in other classes, and I encourage you to continue your learning about these models through professional development as you grow as a teacher. Co-teaching is an equal partnership. It's two equally qualified teachers working together to provide instruction for a classroom of students. Your roles may differ a bit. As the special ed case manager, you're in charge of scheduling IEPs, monitoring progress of a student towards their individualized goals. You're to see that a student is getting their accommodations, and you're to provide individualized instruction as needed. But the gen ed teacher shares all of these roles with you. They're a part of the IEP team, and their input is very important. They too will be providing instruction, and sometimes they will be providing individualized instruction for your students. The goal is the same, and each teacher brings their own expertise. At the higher levels, often your gen ed teacher is your content specialist, and your special education teacher is your learning specialist. And when they put these two areas of expertise together, all students in the classroom, not just those with IEPs, but all students benefit. So true co-teaching involves co-planning. It involves sharing responsibility. For example, the gen ed teacher is sharing responsibility for that student's progress on their IEP goals, while that special ed teacher is sharing responsibility for those SOL scores. Together they work to differentiate instruction so that all students benefit. Now that we've talked a little bit about what co-teaching is, let's just remind everyone of what it is not. Co-teaching is not one gen ed teacher teaching while another teacher is in the classroom to help, or sit in the back of the classroom and just in case they're needed. It's not one teacher making a lesson plan and another teacher taking that lesson plan and trying to help that teacher to implement it. It's not one teacher, such as a special ed teacher, who pulls the same group of kids who always need to read loud or always need extra help and works with them in the back of the classroom. It's not about isolated responsibilities. It's about collaboration. And co-teaching is not a distraction to instruction. It should be an enrichment to instruction. It should never look the same, really. It's going to be different in one classroom, and it's certainly going to be different between classrooms. In the real world, you'll find yourself often having to split your time between more than one general ed classroom. This can make true co-teaching a challenge, but it's not impossible. The important thing to do when you organize your time is to find the times that you are most beneficial to that classroom, and when you're there, you share that instruction with that teacher. The times should be a mutual decision, just like the planning and all other parts of the teaching experience. This slide shows us the most commonly used co-teaching models. The first one teach and one drift, is one that you may see quite often. It's used frequently not because it's the best model, but because it's the easiest to implement. It consists of one teacher teaching content, usually in front of the classroom, and another teacher drifting around to prompt students as needed, provide help as needed, and to intervene where there may be some behavior issues. It has its place, and it can be beneficial, but it's definitely not the best use of having two teachers in the classroom. Next, we have team teaching, which consists of two teachers working together to teach content. And like one teach, one drift, it has its benefits in that often you have a special education teacher who may know a different strategy in teaching the same concept that the teacher's introducing, or the special ed teacher may be able to step in and maybe provide more visuals, or maybe break the task down into smaller steps. So basically, you're taking the expertise of that content specialist and blending it with the learning specialist to provide instruction together. This kind of co-teaching requires a real collaboration, and you kind of have to develop a rhythm to do team teaching. It has its place, but again, it's not the best use of your two teachers. Then you have parallel teaching, which means you basically just divide the class into two groups and you provide instruction on the same exact content, just in a smaller group. This allows for more responding opportunities for the students, and it also allows for the teacher to be able to provide a little bit more individualized instruction. It's important when you're doing parallel teaching to remember that your group should not be just your students with an IEP in one group and your students without an IEP in another. It should be heterogeneous groups that are determined by the teacher and the special ed teacher and the co-teacher, and they should change frequently as well. Next, you have your alternative teaching, which means you have one teacher teaching the larger group of students, while another teacher pulls a small group aside to provide some individualized instruction, remediation, or maybe even some enrichment instruction. Now, I've seen this used a lot in the classrooms that I've worked in, and the thing that I really appreciated about it is it's not always the special education teacher pulling that small group. I worked with one team that at a certain time of the day, the special ed teacher would take the class so that the gen ed teacher could do a small group reading with each of the students in her classroom, so she could kind of evaluate their current levels. And vice versa, there were times in the day when the gen ed teacher was teaching that this special education teacher would pull a small group of students who might need specific remediation in a certain area. Both parallel teaching and alternative teaching are your best use of two teachers because both teachers are teaching. So both teachers are using the skills that they have, and they're providing instruction, which is what they were trained to do. It allows for you to be more individualized in your teaching. For example, in parallel teaching, you may sometimes divide kids up in different groups for a variety of different reasons. Sometimes it's just by interest, by learning styles, by just maybe there is a certain group that's struggling with a specific thing, and you may pull that group for that particular day. Whatever the reason, it allows you to be sure that everyone in there is engaged. Both teachers and students are fully engaged. The one teach, one observe definitely has its place, but it's rare. This is a good opportunity to gather much needed data on a student. For example, if you have a student who's been struggling with staying on task, or perhaps they're working on learning to ask for assistance in appropriate ways, or they're simply learning to start their assignments on time. It might be beneficial for you to measure progress on those specific goals by just observing. And this can go both ways. It can be the teacher observing or the special ed teacher observing. But in reality, it's usually the special ed teacher as they are collecting data for progress on specific goals. Next, we look at station teaching. This is very much like your traditional centers or stations. This again allows for that small group interaction and that opportunity to individualize instruction. Groups in a co-teaching classroom, usually you have two groups that are receiving direct instruction, while you have a third group that's doing independent work. This allows you to take a group of 18 students and divide them into groups of 6. Or if you have a larger group than that, you still don't want your small groups to be much larger than 5 or 6, so that independent group might be a little bit larger. But this allows the students to get individualized instruction, but also to get instruction from both teachers, as the groups should rotate. So just as a recap, your best use of teachers in a co-teaching classroom is if both teachers are teaching. Just remember, it's important that everyone is fully engaged to get the most benefit. So if you walk into a classroom and you see both teachers teaching and you see all students engaged, you know that co-teaching is working the way it was meant to work. This slide shows you the most commonly used co-teaching models. It's certainly not all the possible models, but it is the ones that you will see most often. As we look at each of these models in the next few slides, I want you to keep in mind that the quality of the model is measured by how much it has everyone in the classroom engaged. Basically, the most learning is happening when everyone in the classroom is engaged. This includes teachers as well as students. This is the one teach, one support, or one teach, one drift model. You'll see this quite often, not because it's the best model, but simply because it's the easiest to implement. This consists of one teacher teaching the content while a second teacher drifts around the room providing help as needed, or maybe intervening where there's some behavior issues, or providing prompting to make sure that students are attending. It does require minimal planning, but it also has minimal benefits. With the one teach, one support, one teacher is able to focus on instruction while the other teacher is able to manage the classroom and provide help as needed. Also, the teacher who is drifting in the classroom is able to provide immediate feedback or to help students before they practice something the wrong way, which can be very beneficial. The one teach, one observe model is not used very often, however, it definitely has its place. There are times that it may be necessary for you to collect data on a specific behavioral or functional skill goal. This may require you to actually observe the student during instruction. In this case, the one teach, one observe model would be very appropriate. Also, as an observer in the classroom, you can help the teacher. Maybe you may take some data on how many students appear to be engaged, or what students are responding during group instruction and what students are not. This information, which can be taken by the gen ed or the special ed teacher, can be very helpful to the collaborative team in making decisions about how they can improve their instruction and how they can increase student engagement. Parallel teaching can be very beneficial in that it involves both teachers teaching and the students having an opportunity for a learning experience in a smaller group. The class is divided into two halves, usually, or close to half, and the groups are heterogeneous, and the teachers provide instruction on the same material. So the instruction may vary a little bit. Perhaps one group of students seems to need more hands-on, or one group seems to need more visuals, or one group may be struggling with one particular area. There may be various reasons why you've divided the students as you have, but the important thing is that they're both being provided with instruction on the same content. And this would be ideally for part of the classroom and not all of the instructional time. It's very important that these groups change often and that they don't always stay the same. The alternate teaching model is frequently used, and it consists of one teacher pulling a small group to work on a specific skill or concept, while another teacher provides instruction for the rest of the class. Now, it's important that you don't look at this as just the special education teacher pulling the kids with an IEP to work with them separately while the class goes on with instruction. This should be carefully planned to benefit all students. Oftentimes, I have seen special ed teachers teaching a lesson while the gen ed teacher pulls out small groups of students, maybe to do a reading assessment or to work with them on reading fluency. And vice versa, the gen ed teacher may be working with the entire class, while the special ed teacher pulls out specific groups of students, not necessarily those with IEPs, but any student who may have been struggling with a specific concept or need extra instruction in a certain area. It certainly can be the special education teacher working with students with IEPs, but you shouldn't be pulled with that group solely because you have an IEP. You should be pulled with that alternate group only if it's because your specific learning needs at that particular time fit the instruction that's going on in that group. There again, this requires great planning and collaboration between teachers. Team teaching is basically both teachers teaching the same content at the same time. Basically, both teachers are engaged in instruction for the whole group. And while this isn't the greatest use of your teachers, it can have its place. I have seen teachers who were content specialists who would provide a lesson, and a special ed teacher would jump in to maybe break down the concepts into smaller pieces, or maybe provide more of a visual model for the student to who's more visual to understand, or even just simplify the language. This does require a rhythm. It seems to work best when teachers have talked together for a while, but it can be beneficial even though it's not your best use of both teachers. Station teaching looks a lot like your old-fashioned centers, which are still very much in fashion, but station teaching does allow for everyone in the classroom, including both teachers, to be fully engaged. Generally, in station teaching, you have 3 groups, and you can have more, but generally it's 3 groups. You don't want those groups to be more than 5 or 6 students. So if it's more than that, it might be beneficial to actually divide up into 4 groups. But in a co-teaching setting, you would be able to have at least 2 of those groups led by a teacher who's providing direct instruction. The benefits of this teaching model are obvious. The students are getting very individualized small group instruction, many opportunities to respond, and many opportunities for that teacher to do formative assessments and evaluate exactly what those students need. The benefit of having an extra teacher in the room is obvious. That means you have two stations instead of just one where direct instruction is provided. The remaining stations are generally independent stations, and this is where your technology and computer options come in handy, I think, in today's schools, where you can have students doing some learning opportunities with technology when they're working independently, which was not always an option in the past. There are many variations of co-teaching stations. Some teachers choose to have the students move between stations as they feel this movement is a nice break for the students, while others feel like movement is disruptive and the teachers move, leaving the students in the same area. Sometimes a student may not travel between all stations in the same day. You may actually continue the rotation across 2 days of lessons. And as we've talked about before, sometimes it's necessary to have more than one independent station, and that's fine too. It's whatever works best for the classroom, and again, this is decided between the 2 teachers together. When you do station teaching, it's very important to teach all the routines that are involved up front and get the students in the habits from the very beginning that will support your groups. For example, teach your transition plans. Is it going to be a bell, a timer, a flashing of the lights? It doesn't really matter, but just make sure that the students fully understand what that routine is going to be. It's one of the hardest parts of station teaching is timing everything correctly. Noise levels, you have to have some discussion about when we're working in groups, how do we speak so that we don't disturb other groups. And modeling and practicing this can be very beneficial. You can also assign separate specific roles in groups that help students to have an opportunity to practice responsibilities, which can definitely have benefit in so many ways for students. As we talk about inclusion and co-teaching models, it's very important that we don't lose sight of specially designed instruction. Remember that if a student has an IEP, this means that an eligibility team met at one time and determined that this student requires specially designed instruction. Specially designed instruction simply means instruction that's based on an individual student's needs as indicated by assessments. It should be systematic and focused on the student's individualized goals. Its effectiveness should be continually monitored through data collection and analysis. It can vary in intensity from just very simple accommodations and maybe occasional supports, maybe a reteaching of a concept here and there, or prompts and redirections as needed, to very, very intensive instruction one-on-one or in a small group using specialized programs or interventions. Whenever possible, to the greatest extent possible, educate students with their peers in the general education classroom. As we've talked about these co-teaching models, there are more than one that offers opportunities for specialized instruction. For example, station teaching would provide opportunities to do a small group session, same as the alternate group teaching. This would allow you to pull a small group of students and provide instruction on a specific goal. Even the one teach and one drift or one support gives a special education teacher opportunities to maybe provide extra visuals for a student, or quickly reteach a concept, or break a concept down into smaller, easier to understand steps. There are many ways we can see that a student's needs are met without removing them from the classroom. However, there are times that students' needs are such that they do need to be pulled out for more intensive services, such as a specialized reading group, or maybe even for behavioral interventions. When this is the case, work closely with the gen ed teacher to plan that time out of the classroom carefully so that it has the least impact on their time in the general ed classroom. Also, it should always be a goal to work that student back into the general ed classroom, if it's by learning to use accommodations more independently, or improving reading levels or math concepts, or even helping that student to manage their behavior through behavior plan or specific reinforcement interventions. In closing, I just want to emphasize the following points. Always implement an IEP as written. That seems simple, but there may be situations that come up that you aren't expecting. For example, sometimes high school students will decide they don't want a certain accommodation. They may have the read aloud accommodation for tests, and they suddenly start refusing to accept that. It's not okay just to let that go. It needs to be changed on the IEP. Even if the student is 18 years old and can make that decision on his own, his or her own, you need to sit down with that student and actually change that IEP to reflect what's happening. Another example would be you may have a student's IEP that says that they're in the gen ed classroom all day, they're fully included, but then they suddenly start having a lot of behavior issues and you're finding yourself pulling them out regularly. It's not okay just to let that keep happening. You need to go in and adjust that IEP to provide more services so that the student can stay in the gen ed classroom, or actually change their services to reflect that they're being pulled out of the classroom. Implement your co-teaching and specific interventions with fidelity, which means, back up what you're doing with research. If you're using co-teaching, use it the way that research has shown that it's most effective. If you're using specific interventions or programs, make sure that they are solid research-based programs. Monitor progress continually. Don't wait until the end of 9 weeks and then discover that a student hasn't made any progress. Always be monitoring progress so that you can adjust your instruction accordingly. And if you have adjusted your instruction and you really feel like the goal is just not appropriate for the student, don't let that goal stay on their IEP. Meet with that IEP team again and adjust that goal so that it's more appropriate for that student. There are so many ways that co-teachers can work together to bring the best to the students. Just remember when you're planning with your co-teacher to think of how you can be most engaged as a teacher and how you can work together to make sure that the students who are in a co-teaching classroom are getting more than the students who are not. Make sure that they're getting more opportunities to respond, more opportunity for individualized instruction, more opportunities for remedial instruction, and more opportunities for enrichment. This is the benefit of true co-teaching when it's done the way it was designed to be done.